Welcome to Chapter 7.7, Conducting World War II. I have been waiting all year to teach this lesson, and now I don't even get to see you in person when I do it. So in lieu of talking to myself, I've narrowed down the scope of information to just the AP World Key concept that is pretty vast and encapsulates most of this war experience. I'll make additional opportunities to discuss some of the lesser known aspects of the war or some of the more interesting points that you might want to discuss. But in the meantime, let's take a look at what we need to do. Review! Our first warm-up for today is how did the Treaty of Versailles impact post-war nationalism? There are a lot of answers that you could give to this, so please write as many as you can down and then we'll check your answers. And here are my responses. Check your answers, see if you have many or even some of these responses. And if you are looking at any of them and wondering what they are, please take a moment to go look back at 7.5 where you can find them all. And one more question. What were the causes of World War II? Write some responses and check your answers. Here are the underlying causes of World War II. Take a look at your list and see which ones you have. If any of these are confusing, please go back and check Chapter 7.6 or ask some questions. Lastly, here's some terminology that will be used throughout this video. I thought it would be beneficial to have a definition up front in case you're unfamiliar with any of these words. Our learning goal for today is to explain similarities and differences in how governments used a variety of methods to conduct the war. Now we have two key concepts. The first one is pretty darn long. World War II was a total war. Governments used a variety of strategies, including political propaganda, art, media, and intensified forms of nationalism to mobilize populations, both in the home countries and the colonies or former colonies, for the purpose of waging war. Governments used ideologies, including fascism and communism, to mobilize all of their states' resources for war and, in the case of totalitarian states, to repress basic freedoms and dominate many aspects of daily life during the course of the conflicts and beyond. Most of this lesson is going to be addressing that first key concept, but the second one is also really integral. New military technology and new tactics, including the atomic bomb, firebombing, and the waging of total war, led to increased levels of wartime casualties. We're actually going to start with key concept number 2 as we look at Japan's invasion of China. We begin in China. Japan launched its conquest of Chinese Manchuria with the Mukden incident in 1931, creating the puppet state of Manchukuo. In 1937, a full-scale invasion of China was launched, known as the Second Sino-Japanese War. Hot on the heels of World War II, this conflict is generally considered a warm-up for Japan's involvement in the larger conflict, much like Hitler used his Luftwaffe, or Air Force, in Guernica as a practice run. Japan's invasion was brutal. This photograph is often wrongfully attributed to the atomic bombing of Japan. In fact, it was taken in China after the initial aerial bombing of Shanghai by the Japanese. Not far inland from this major trade city is the city of Nanjing, also pronounced Nanking, and this is where some of the worst atrocities in modern recorded warfare were committed. This event is known as the Rape of Nanjing, and it is a lesson I wish I did not have to teach. Like the Holocaust, the images are disturbing and often horrifying. But even more so than the Holocaust, these deaths were incredibly personal. There were no gas chambers or machine guns. Instead, there were intimate encounters with each victim. They were isolated from their families, and they watched their loved ones raped, maimed, tortured, and massacred in very personal ways, knowing that they would meet the same end sometime soon. Nobody, from the infants to the elderly, were safe from the atrocities that were committed. Soldiers were instructed to use swords, knives, and bayonets to toughen their resolve and save bullets. Men and boys were commonly used for bayonet practice to inflict wound after wound and prolong the suffering. Babies were tossed like balls. Family members were buried alive while others had to watch. Chinese men were forced to rape their daughters or mothers to save their wives or other children, which in the end didn't happen. It's estimated that 300,000 Chinese citizens were massacred and 10 to 20,000 women were raped. Scores more were taken away to fill comfort houses. There they would become prostitutes for Japanese soldiers until they became pregnant or contracted a venereal disease. A small group of Western businessmen and missionaries, including a high-ranking Nazi official named John Rabe, attempted to set up a neutral area in Nanjing that would provide refuge for the city's citizens. The safety zone opened in November of 1937 and was roughly the size of New York Central Park. It consisted of little more than a dozen small refugee camps. But on December 1st, the Chinese government abandoned Nanjing, leaving the International Committee in charge. All remaining citizens were ordered into the 2.5-mile safety zone for their protection, which swelled to 500,000 people. The Japanese inspected all the men and arrested anyone who had calluses that resembled those of a common soldier. They raided the safety zone at night to kidnap women and harassed everyone they could, except for John Rabe, the Nazi official who tried to defend them all. This Japanese aggression spurred a united front policy between the Chinese communists under Mao Zedong and the nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek. Guerrilla warfare tied down half of the Japanese army, which was then unable to move as rapidly into Chinese territory as it hoped. Yet clashes between communists and nationalists continued, and by the end of the war, communists gained the popular support. Italy, under the fascist leadership of Benito Mussolini, had also stepped up its aggressive actions. In 1935, the nation invaded Ethiopia with overwhelming force, attacking with powerful weapons, armored vehicles, and even poison gas. This time, Ethiopians didn't stand a chance. Although some 2,000 Italian troops were killed, Ethiopian deaths exceeded 275,000. Rebellions that followed were met with brute force, and the Addis Ababa massacre is a notorious example of Italian brutality. Italy's holdings expanded during World War II, and red areas on this map mark control prior to 1939, while those in pink were acquired during the war until Italy surrendered and then changed sides in 1943. So what was Hitler up to at this time? In defiance of the Treaty of Versailles, Hitler had stopped all reparations payments, started rearming Germany, reoccupied the Rhineland in 1936, annexed Austria in 1938, and then began threatening Czechoslovakia. All of these actions met with little resistance from a Europe anxious to avoid another massive conflict on the continent. In the interest of appeasing Hitler, Italy, France, Great Britain, and Germany met in September of 1938 at the Munich Conference in Germany. Following their policy of appeasement, Allies agreed to allow Hitler to annex the Sudetenland. This was an area of Czechoslovakia with a German population of at least 50%. In return, Hitler promised to halt all his expansionist efforts. When British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain returned to England after declaring that they had achieved peace for our time, he was met with celebration. Little did he know Hitler would invade the rest of Czechoslovakia less than 6 months later. In addition to his aggression internationally, Hitler turned his ire on the Jews. The persecution of German Jews began in 1933 when Hitler had enough authority to limit personal freedoms as Chancellor. At the annual party rally held in Nuremberg in 1935, the Nazis announced new laws which institutionalized many of the racial theories prevalent in Nazi ideology. The laws excluded German Jews from Reich citizenship and prohibited them from marrying or having sexual relations with persons of German or related blood. The laws led to local ordinances that disenfranchised Jews and deprived them of most of their political rights. The Nuremberg laws, as they became known, did not define a Jew as someone with particular religious beliefs. Instead, anyone who had 3 or 4 Jewish grandparents was defined as a Jew, regardless of whether that individual identified himself or herself as a Jew, or even belonged to the Jewish religious community. Many Germans who had not practiced Judaism for years found themselves caught in the grip of Nazi terror. Even people with Jewish grandparents who had converted to Christianity were defined as Jews. However, treatment of Jews deteriorated even further on the evening of November 9, 1938, when Kristallnacht, or the Night of Broken Glass, occurred. Nazi mobs in Germany, Austria, and the Sudetenland torched synagogues, vandalized Jewish homes, schools, and businesses, killed close to 100 Jews, and rounded up close to 30,000 Jews for deportation to concentration camps. The events of Kristallnacht occurred after a 17-year-old ethnically Polish Jew shot a German diplomat in retaliation for his parents' deportation to Poland from their home in Germany. The diplomat died from his wounds 2 days later, and Joseph Goebbels, the Nazi Minister for Public Enlightenment and Propaganda, immediately seized on the assassination to rile Hitler supporters into an anti-Semitic frenzy. From here forward, persecution of Jews would be far more harsh and overt. These collective events earned Adolf Hitler the title Man of the Year for 1938. From the cover of Time magazine, it's clear that this was not as a result of his exceptional leadership, but for his manipulative, secretive, and violent policies. But he wasn't finished. In August of 1939, Hitler signed the secret Russian-German Treaty of Non-Aggression, otherwise known as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Despite his complete lack of respect for communism and Joseph Stalin, Hitler was anticipating his invasion of Poland in the coming weeks and wanted to avoid the two-front war that had plagued Germany in 1914. Besides agreeing not to attack each other, the two dictators negotiated a split of Poland and established zones of influence in Eastern Europe. And then it happened. September 1st, 1939, Hitler released his Blitzkrieg, or lightning war, strategy on Poland. The German Luftwaffe bombed and strafed civilian targets, causing confusion on the ground. Armored divisions rushed in afterwards, and German military even donned Polish uniforms to provide misleading instruction. The Soviets attacked from the east. In addition, German U-boats, or submarines, began to patrol the Atlantic, threatening British shipping lanes and restricting aid to Europe. By June of 1940, Germany successfully occupied Poland, Denmark, Luxembourg, Norway, Belgium, and France using blitzkrieg warfare, and once again circumventing the highly fortified Maginot Line along the German border. British defending forces were almost entirely defeated until an ill-advised halt of ground troops allowed over 300,000 British and French soldiers to be rescued off the beaches of Dunkirk in late May and early June. On June 22nd, Hitler forced the French to sign an armistice agreement in the same railroad car used for the armistice imposed on Germany in 1918. To say that he was pleased was an understatement. He toured Paris, had German troops march through Napoleon's Arc de Triomphe, and required citizens to line the streets and salute. Germany only occupied part of France. The occupied zone secluded Britain from European allies and offered Germany deep-water harbors with immediate access to the Atlantic. The southern half of France was considered the Free Zone, otherwise referred to as Vichy France. The nature of the Vichy government has been controversial and revised over time. Initially, the police state was excused as the lesser of two evils and a necessity for France to survive German occupation. As time has passed, however, its status as a willing collaborator with German policies and its anti-Semitic programs has made it difficult to excuse. One way or another, by late 1942, Germany completed its occupation of France when Allied threats mounted. There is one more player here, the Free French. Under the exiled leadership of Charles de Gaulle, the future president of France, thousands of French resisted the Germans and the Vichy regime. Many were women and youths who sabotaged railroads and bridges at home, while others joined Allied forces to fight for the complete liberation of the country. As in Japanese-occupied lands, Germany employed policies of collective punishment for those caught resisting. After the war, those who were accused of conspiring with the Germans were punished. As a result of vigilante justice and reprisals, men were often shot, and women were stripped in public, had their heads shaved, and taunted before being exiled from their region. These were common punishments meted out in occupied nations to address those who had turned their backs on their country. On the flip side of the coin, most people interviewed after the war claimed to have taken active part in their nation's resistance movements, which clearly could not have been the case. But let's return to German expansion. Next, Hitler turned his sights on Britain. From July 10th to October 31st, 1940, the German Luftwaffe engaged in the Blitz, a heavy bombing campaign in large cities, particularly London. Although children were evacuated to the countryside and many citizens slept in the subway tubes, over 40,000 British civilians were killed in urban bombing raids. I strongly suggest you check out the interactive London Blitz resource on my website. It maps every bomb that fell on the city in detail, and it's quite staggering. Newly elected British Prime Minister Winston Churchill broadcast uplifting radio messages to British citizens during this difficult time. They refused to surrender, and the Royal Air Force, or RAF, prevented Germany from outright invading. Hitler's expansionist policies were certainly rooted in empire building, but there was also another motivation, the desire for Lebensraum, or living space, for his Aryan race. 1 year to the day after signing an armistice with France, Hitler double-crossed Stalin and invaded the USSR. Stalin was caught completely off guard, but not because he hadn't been warned. In early 1941, Soviet spies in multiple countries reported that the Nazis were preparing to strike. The Luftwaffe had been violating Soviet airspace for reconnaissance for months leading up to the conflict, and Soviet intelligence even named the date of the invasion no fewer than 47 times in the 10 days before they arrived. Needless to say, when the Nazis struck, they crushed Russian defenses along a 2,000-mile front and advanced 400 miles inland in a matter of weeks. But there's a reason commanders study military history. Severe winter and long supply lines weakened the German efforts just as they had for Napoleon. The Soviets regrouped and went on the offensive in the spring of 1942. The Battle of Stalingrad that ended in February of 1943 turned the tide for the USSR, but it wasn't until 1944 that the Soviets reached their pre-attack line. From there, the Red Army marched on into Berlin. Operation Barbarossa opened up the Eastern Front, in which more forces were committed than in any other theater of war in history. The area saw some of the war's largest battles, highest casualties, and terrible atrocities. The German armies eventually captured some 5 million Soviet troops, a majority of which never returned alive. Germans deliberately exposed them to the elements or starved to death 3.3 million prisoners of war, including Stalin's son and a vast number of civilians. This was part of the Nazis' hunger plan, which worked to exterminate the Slavic population to make room for Aryan expansion. Mass shootings and gassing operations carried out by the Einsatzgruppen, or mobile killing squads, murdered over 1 million Soviet Jews as part of the Holocaust. Throughout the initial years of the war, the U.S. attempted to stay out of European affairs. With a high population of Italians, Germans, and other European immigrants, it was a dangerous political line to walk. Instead, the government initiated a cash-and-carry policy to supply allies with arms, and later the Lend-Lease program allowed the U.S. to lend war goods to cash-strapped allies and then lease naval bases in return. As for Japan, the island nation's aggression in the Pacific prompted the U.S. to freeze Japanese assets in the country and place an embargo on oil shipments to Japan. While the United States hoped embargoes on oil and other key goods would lead Japan to halt its expansionism, the sanctions actually convinced the nation to stand its ground against what it perceived as continued Western interference. In a surprise attack on December 7, 1941, Japanese pilots attacked the Pearl Harbor Naval Base on Hawaii. Its bombers hit all 8 U.S. battleships, sinking 4 and damaging 4 others, destroyed or damaged more than 300 aircraft, and killed some 2,400 Americans. Although the mission appeared to be a Japanese success, none of the U.S. aircraft carriers were actually in port at the time, and oil tanks, ammunition sites, and repair facilities were still viable. This enabled the United States to recover far more rapidly than the Japanese hoped. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt famously described Pearl Harbor as a date which will live in infamy, and the U.S. declared war on Japan the following day. Hitler and Mussolini defended Japan by declaring war on the U.S. on December 11th, and the U.S. committed to join the Western Front hours later. Today, this event is commemorated as Pearl Harbor Remembrance Day. Until the attacks on the World Trade Center on September 11, 2001, it was the largest assault on American soil since the Revolutionary War. The USS Arizona, whose massive explosion killed all but 200 crewmen on board at the time, represents half of all the lives lost during the Pearl Harbor attack. Currently, it lies underwater in Pearl Harbor, with the USS Arizona Memorial standing above the hull to honor all those who died that day. Japan rapidly dominated Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands. Hong Kong, Guam, and Singapore were all lost by February of 1942, and then the American Philippines fell in May. The approximately 75,000 Filipino and American troops who surrendered on the Bataan Peninsula near Manila were forced to make a 65-mile march to prison camps. They made the trek in intense heat and were subjected to harsh treatment by Japanese guards. Thousands perished from dehydration, starvation, and bayoneting in what became known as the Bataan Death March. Thousands more died in the camps. In these newly conquered lands, Japan worked to establish the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, claiming to liberate Asian nations from Western imperialism. Although Japan was welcomed at first, their belief in Japanese racial superiority ended the honeymoon. Many civilians were sent to work in industrial centers to support the Japanese war machine, and thousands of young women were sent to comfort homes. But Japan underestimated the United States. Having undergone a massive military reorganization and training program, possessing substantial personnel reserves, and an industrial capacity that had been largely lying dormant during the Great Depression, the U.S. was able to mobilize and produce war materiel on an unprecedented scale. Particularly important was our shipbuilding and automotive production, which was adapted to manufacture tanks and planes with assembly line speed and accuracy. World War II was a total war. That means that war is unrestricted in terms of the weapons used, the territory or combatants involved, and often the laws of war are disregarded. The mobilization of civilians is integral to success in total war, and it's often why fighting targeted industrial centers. Millions of civilians died in Europe and Asia during World War II. In the United States, however, this wasn't the case. African Americans and women played a major role in U.S. mobilization. African Americans migrated to the North in vast numbers to work in factory jobs, and many males received pay equal to their white counterparts. Just as in World War I, women also occupied the jobs of men who were away at war. Unlike African American males, however, comparable pay was still a pipe dream. Government propaganda like the iconic Rosie the Riveter was used to get more women into critical war-related jobs at the beginning of the war, but by the end of the war, the goal was to get the women to give up those jobs and drop out of the workforce so there would be more jobs for the men returning from the front. However, the world wars had a cumulative and lasting impact on the women's movement. After the Great War, women gained suffrage in Europe and the United States, and after World War II, they developed the empowerment to seek acceptance and equality in the workforce. Women also joined the military. WAVES, or Women Appointed for Volunteer Emergency Service, was the women's branch of the United States Naval Reserve during World War II. They took office and clerical jobs in the armed forces in order to free men to fight. They also drove trucks, repaired airplanes, worked as laboratory technicians, rigged parachutes, served as radio operators, analyzed photographs, and flew military aircraft across the country. At their height in 1944, there were over 85,000 WAVES enlisted. Some women served near the front lines in the Army Nurse Corps, but none were permitted to serve directly in combat. Not all nations had the same policy, however. Soviet and Chinese forces included women's battalions, and a few individuals gained notoriety for their skills with weapons. In occupied nations and in Jewish communities, women also played a heavy role in resistance movements. Men served in most combatant roles during the war. Although they could volunteer for service, they were conscripted to fight in all participating nations and in their colonial possessions. As the war progressed, nations like the Soviet Union, Germany, and Japan recruited from younger and younger populations. In the U.S., the average age of combat soldiers was 26. By the end of the war, the average age of German soldiers dropped from 22 to 17, and in Japan from 24 to 16. The U.S. segregated its military, and African Americans, Latinos, Hawaiians, and Japanese Americans and other racial minority soldiers fought extra hard to win the respect of their nation. The double V for victory represented victory on the battlefront from tyranny and victory on the home front against racism. Many roles for minority groups involve logistics. The U.S. segregated its military, and African Americans, Latinos, Hawaiians, Japanese Americans, and other racial minority soldiers fought extra hard to win the respect of their nation. The double V for victory represented victory on the battlefront from tyranny and victory on the home front against racism. Many roles for minority groups involved logistics, but combat groups like the Tuskegee Airmen and recruits from the Montford Point Marines were often recognized by their white counterparts for their extreme valor and talents in battle. The Tuskegee Airmen were awarded a total of 150 Distinguished Flying Crosses, 8 Purple Hearts, 14 Bronze Stars, 3 Distinguished Unit Citations, and 744 Air Medals for their service in the U.S. military. This was a strong step forward for integration after the war, although discrimination and segregation would legally continue until the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The U.S. was not the only country using total warfare. Hitler's fascist ideology of state above all else was drummed into the minds of young Germans. Their belief in their Führer and of a greater Aryan empire made them indispensable to Hitler and to the Nazi Party. The Hitler Youth was created in 1935 to integrate young people into a strong fascist state. One part Boy Scouts, which had just been banned, and one part Nazi paramilitary, children learned physical fitness, weapon operation, and Nazi ideologies. They were rewarded for reporting anti-Nazi actions of friends, neighbors, and family, and for keeping an ear to the ground for any information that might benefit the party. As these young men turned of age, they became Hitler's most valiant and feared soldiers. Even when the war seemed hopeless for Germany, the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend fought to the death, many as young as 14. German women were also mobilized. Encouraged to become physically fit, good mothers, and productive farmers in the absence of males, women deemed racially pure were also encouraged to produce as many offspring as possible. Some were even matched with high-ranking military officials to produce the Lebensborn, children raised by the Nazi Party to become perfect Aryans. Propaganda played a major role in committing citizens to the war effort. All Germans were issued a radio to listen to daily Nazi news reports and propaganda. But in other nations, movies, radio programs, songs, and even comic books often had war themes. Posters encouraged Americans to support the war effort by buying bonds, rationing, growing their own food in victory gardens, enlisting in the military, and keeping tight-lipped about the war. In the US and abroad, racist propaganda of the enemy was common. Jews were heavily targeted in the Reich, including in Vichy France. Also demonized were communists, capitalists, and any ideology that ran counter to National Socialism. The United States in particular played upon the fears of citizens in posters, political cartoons, and movies. If you are unfamiliar with this particular time in media communications, go to my website where there are links to the work of Dr. Seuss, Warner Brothers, and Disney. You may be unpleasantly surprised. This fear grew exponentially in the US after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Under Executive Order 9066, Japanese internment camps were established by President Roosevelt. From 1942 to 1945, it was the policy of the U.S. government that people of Japanese descent would be interred in these camps. Between 110,000 and 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry moved, most of whom lived on the Pacific coast. Canada soon followed suit, relocating 21,000 of its Japanese residents from its west coast. Mexico enacted its own version, and eventually over 2,000 more people of Japanese descent were removed from Peru, Brazil, Chile, and Argentina to the United States. Japanese internment camps are now considered one of the most atrocious violations of American civil rights in the 20th century. Actor George Takei spent 4 years of his youth in these prison camps. Check out his story on my website. The U.S. sent troops overseas to fight first in the Pacific. The Battle of the Coral Sea, Midway, and Guadalcanal in 1942 and 1943 gave Allies forward momentum as they island hopped across the Pacific to get air and naval forces closer to Japan. The closer they got, the more desperately Japanese soldiers defended their homeland. Kamikaze pilots committed suicide in the ultimate sacrifice for their country by flying their planes into Allied ships. Guerrilla fighters refused to surrender even when faced with certain defeat, and the savage battle for Okinawa took 2 months. There are numerous instances of Japanese soldiers who refused to believe that the war ended in 1945 and remained battle-ready on isolated islands in the Pacific until the 1960s and 70s. In Europe, the Red Army gained the offensive against Germany in early 1943, and British and U.S. forces attacked in North Africa and then Italy. Then Allies launched Operation Overlord in June of 1944. This was the push to break through Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's fortified Atlantic Wall to liberate European nations under the Nazi regime. It began with the D-Day landings on the beaches of Normandy on June 6, 1944. It was the largest amphibious attack in the history of warfare and one that I could spend another 6 videos discussing. In the words of my favorite D-Day historian, the operation was massive, complex, and uncertain. Launched from Britain in rough seas and inclement weather, pilots bombed too far inland to destroy German artillery. Paratroopers missed their drop zones, and landed craft were blown off course with the currents. The first wave of troops were generally young recruits who the military expected would not make it. With tall cliffs ahead and cold seas behind, these young men scrambled across a wide beach covered in barbed wire and mines in heavy fire. That day, General Eisenhower carried 2 letters in his pocket. One was for a victorious landing, the other was in case of defeat. He was so stressed he even dated it wrong. The landing occurred in June. Despite the obstacles, D-Day was a success, and Free French troops joined Allied forces from the south in a giant pincher towards Germany. Sometimes progress was rapid, and other times ground was lost with high casualties. The Battle of the Bulge is the most notorious example of the ferocious fighting to keep the Allies at bay in the west. Allies fought through the Ardennes forest in the dead of winter only to be pushed back by Nazi troops and then regain the same territory while defending the city of Bastogne. The battle lasted 6 weeks, ending in late January of 1945. U.S. and British operations also amped up bombing campaigns as well. As more land was liberated, bombers could get within range of German cities. In February of 1945, the Allies took a new tactic in aerial warfare, firebombing. Firebombs are early versions of napalm and were designed to create fire instead of traditional concussion. The city of Dresden, a German arts and industrial center, was attacked with firebombs day and night for almost 48 hours. Civilians took shelter in their homes and in bomb shelters underground. The inferno was so fierce that it sucked the oxygen from all but the most subterranean of shelters and destroyed practically everything that could burn. Kurt Vonnegut, American author and German prisoner of war at the time, wrote about his experience dragging the dead from their shelters in his book Slaughterhouse-Five. In all, an estimated 135,000 Germans are estimated to have been killed in their shelters. After the suicide of Adolf Hitler on April 30th, 1945, Germany surrendered on May 8th on what is now known as VE Day for Victory in Europe. This allowed the Allies to focus on the Pacific Front, and the Soviet Union too, but that's a video for another time. The US was within range of Tokyo by March of 1945, and resistance continued to be fierce. In response, an intense firebombing campaign ensued that was so extreme it killed 100,000 civilians and wiped out half the city. The U.S. military had waited for a clear and windy night to inflict maximum damage, and on March 9, 1945, the conditions were perfect. 300 B-29 bombers dropped nearly 500,000 cylinders of napalm and petroleum jelly on the most densely populated areas of Tokyo. The blaze traveled faster than humans could run, and civilians threw themselves into the Sumida River to survive. The oily residue was not extinguished by the water, and soon even the surface of the river was ablaze. In just 2 days, more than 100,000 people were killed, 1 million were maimed, and another 1 million were made homeless. Despite the devastation to Tokyo, the Japanese did not surrender. This prompted a difficult and controversial decision to be made. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt passed away on April 12, 1945, and Vice President Harry Truman took the oath of office in his stead. To continue with a land invasion of Japan would be to commit an already war-weary nation to at least another year of intense fighting against a Japanese army of 2 million defending their homeland. Instead, President Truman opted to turn to the success of the Manhattan Project. The Manhattan Project was a large group of the world's finest minds who had worked to split the atom and harvest that power in a military device. An Allied demand for an immediate and unconditional surrender was made to Japan in August of 1945. Although the demand stated that refusal would result in total destruction, no mention of any new weapons of mass destruction was made. The Japanese military command rejected the request for unconditional surrender, but there were indications that a conditional surrender was possible. Regardless, on August 6, 1945, a plane called the Enola Gay dropped an atomic bomb on the city of Hiroshima. Instantly, 70,000 Japanese citizens were vaporized. In the months and years that followed, an additional 100,000 perished from burns and radiation sickness. 2 days after the first bomb, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan. The very next day, a second atomic bomb was dropped on Nagasaki, where 80,000 Japanese people perished. The damage done by these two bombs was unprecedented. Never had a weapon so thoroughly or quickly destroyed a city and its population. The decision to use atomic weapons is still one of intense controversy today. The destruction it wreaked has created a period of relative peace, but it has also opened doors to the possibility of complete human annihilation. The surrender of Imperial Japan was announced by Japanese Emperor Hirohito on August 15th and was formally signed on September 2, 1945, bringing the end to World War II in what would be known as VJ Day, Victory in Japan. When all is said and done, conflict continued past VJ Day. Europe was divided in two. Korea sought failed unification after Japanese occupation. The Vietnamese threw off Japanese imperialism only to be subjugated by the French once more. Cold War politics, nuclear proliferation, and proxy wars would occupy much of international politics until the 1990s. More immediately, though, was the issue of getting people back to a new normal. As the extent of Nazi crimes against Jews and other targeted groups became clear, there was an issue of adequate justice. But then, what about the United States? Hadn't we firebombed Dresden and Tokyo and dropped 2 atomic bombs? But then again, hadn't Japan been brutal to China and other occupied lands? What about Soviet, Czech, and French complicity in the Holocaust? What about the state of London, of Leningrad, and Stalingrad? World War II was a horrible conflict that completely altered human existence around the world. Balancing the preservation of the past as a warning for future generations and letting it create endless cycles of finger-pointing continues to be challenging. Those who lived through World War I were called the Lost Generation. Those who lived through World War II we call the Greatest Generation. For better or for worse, through their sacrifices we enjoy a period of relative peace that most other times have not been fortunate enough to experience. I said at the beginning this was going to be a long one, so let's take a look again at what you need to know. We're going to take out all the extra words and get down to the heart of the matter. World War II was a total war. Governments used a variety of strategies to mobilize populations for the purpose of waging war. Governments used ideologies to mobilize all of their states' resources for war and to repress basic freedoms and dominate many aspects of daily life during the course of the conflicts and beyond. And then our second key concept, new military technology and new tactics, including the atomic bomb, firebombing, and the waging of total war, led to increased levels of wartime casualties. If any of these concepts is unclear, please revisit the textbook, ask questions, or take a look at some of the supplementary links on my website. Our next lesson is mass atrocity in the 20th century, so it promises to be just as bleak as the war itself. Cheer up, Unit 8 is right around the corner.